Welcome to one more webinar promoted by the Extension Project Internationalization at Home. Thank you very much for your interest in being part of this event. The main objective of this project is to deepen the discussion on topics concerning internationalization and related topics through webinars open to the public of the UFMG community and also for the public of the external community. Today's presentation is entitled Theorizing Cultural Regions in the Immigrant Societies of the Americas and will be held by Professor Mark Peterson. Professor Peterson holds a PhD degree in organizational psychology from the University of Michigan in the United States. He has published over 130 articles and chapters and several books. The articles have appeared in major management and international management journals. So it's really an honor for us to have Professor Peterson with us today. After Professor Peterson's presentation, all participants are very welcome to participate in the discussion with comments or with questions, okay? So without further ado, Professor Peterson, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. You can please make your presentation now.
Thank you very much, Andre. It's a great pleasure to be part of this UFMG program. I'm delighted to finally get some contact so that I can actually see Brasilia. This is the closest I've been to seeing Brasilia, which means the inside of your office. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about one of the couple of main topics that has arisen in research about culture and business, and that is the significance of within-country cultural regions compared to countries. Now, to do that, it's probably useful to explain what I have in mind when I refer to culture, since people use the word in quite a variety of ways. And here on the screen is a definition that I've used elsewhere. Importantly, culture is a characteristic of societies. Culture is not a characteristic of an individual. Individuals can react to culture. Culture influences individuals, but it's a little bit different, what an individual and a society. So, and in this project that I'm providing the theory portion of a project that I've been working on for quite some years. And that project suggests that culture does have an implication for people's personal values, so that if there is a cultural influence on values, you should see differences in values between one cultural area and another, and will also affect how a work team operates in organizations. So culture will affect those two things. The aspects of culture that I'm going to be especially concerned with are individualism-related things, like values associated with self-directed achievement. Those value measures, I'm not going to talk about the measures, I'm talking about theory today, but the measures that I've used in this project are adapted from the Schwartz Values Survey. And also workplace perceptions have to do with reliance on self. That's an individualism related sort of a thing. That is, dealing with different kinds of work situations. How much do managers say, and I'm the studies of managers here, how much do managers say they rely on themselves? Also, I'm dealing with authority-related or authority deference-related constructs. One from the Schwartz Value Survey is conservation. It has to do with traditionalism. And in the Social Sources of Guidance project, how much people say they rely on superiors. And the reason for focusing on those two things go back especially to the formation of the United States and regional differences in the United States. As I'll indicate as we go along, some parts of the United States were formed by people that are particularly rebellious against authority and individualism oriented, and some were more sympathetic to authority, notably royal authority, and less individualism oriented. And also this project is oriented to comparing country and within country regions rather than studying just one or the other, or assuming in advance that countries matter more than within country regions or vice versa. Uh, as background, there's some literature already, quite a bit of literature that I'm building on regarding within country region differences in country culture. There's a pretty established literature that suggests that country culture usually matters, that Brazil is different from Argentina culturally, and that occasionally and sometimes we find that within country regions matter, but very often we don't find that, or it only applies to some regions. So countries divide up themselves into administrative regions, some of which had cultural significance and don't any longer, some of which never have cultural significance, and some which continue to have cultural significance. And it's that topic that my colleagues around the world and I have been working on. When do within country cultures matter? There are a number of articles for many years, 20 or 30 years, suggesting that we should attend to within country regions. And those articles have been responded to in several substantive ways, some of which I'll detail. One is research to identify an area's cultural regions. A second is something that I've developed to sort out the theories associated with culture and geography, and that's functional, institutional, and critical events, or FICE theorizing, and I'll explain that more in a bit. And also there's a business literature that some of my colleagues and I reviewed recently about cultural regions, and I'll also describe that a bit. The example that I'm going to be developing has to do with the regions along the Canada and US border, and I'll identify those. Those are interesting both because of similarities and because of differences. At the end, I want to talk just a little bit about implications and limitations of what I've done so far for other parts of the world, notably the parts of the world that I think you folks are most interested in, Lusophone areas. Now, first, there's a pretty substantial literature that focuses on identifying an area's cultural regions. And the major contributions of this research are to analyze exemplars that show the limitations of country cultures as being predominant. So this research has especially looked for and selected parts of the world where country cultures may not be as significant as some within country cultures. Let's see. As part of this work, I've seen my colleagues be very careful to firmly identify cultural regions in whatever part of the world they're studying based on a careful review. So one of the examples noted below, led by Ratan Dir, did a really thorough review of the literature about U.S. Canada cultural differences, and also the literature about individual cultural regions of those two countries. So some of these studies identifying cultural regions have done that very careful review. And then these studies have used survey research, usually secondary studies, but some primary data studies, to validate whether the region differences found from the literature actually can be documented. The basic approach that was provided by Lenardowitz and Roth quite some time ago. There's some really good examples of applications to Brazil and Northern Latin America. The applications in Northern Latin America suggest that regions other than countries may matter more than countries, tend to matter more than countries in those particular areas. And then there's a US-Canada study that I just mentioned by Deere and colleagues. And I was involved helping out with a study of India, but there are also studies of China and Vietnam. So there's several studies that focus on identifying whether there are within country regions that are culturally meaningful. Another set of studies is this FICE model that I mentioned that I had been developing. The major contributions of this approach, which is mainly reflected in an article noted at the very bottom, the 2018 Journal of International Business Studies, JIBS article, is to first theorize administrative regions That is, why have administrative regions emerged at different levels? And administrative regions include supranational, supra-country organizations like the European Union or NATO. The countries did not always exist in the modern sense. Countries were invented in since 1500 more or less. And within country administrative regions, that is theorizing why countries divide themselves into within country regions. For example, one thing that we worked on quite a bit was the whether there is utility in having federations. Federations are countries that deliberately delegate substantial power to administrative regions. So the United States is a federation in that sense. States have a lot of influence. Other countries don't. So why are there within country regions? Are they to delegate control, or are they for bureaucratic purposes of other sorts, having a workable tax authority? And also, it's been important, I think, to theorize implicit cultural areas. That is, parts of a larger area or combinations of larger areas that are culturally significant but may or may not correspond to administrative boundaries. And these could be large ethnic communities like the Lusophone world or the Anglo world. They can be ethnic nations in the sense of the Métis people of Canada, one of the First Nation integrated with early European French settlers, parts of Canada, and also local ethnic groups. There are pieces of groups that are often referred to as clans, tribes, or bands that are quite localized. Sometimes residuals of larger groups that were either largely exterminated or driven out of a geographic area. So explicitly theorizing both explicit administrative areas and cultural areas would be important to theorizing the relationship between administrative areas and cultural areas. And that's what this is intended to do. And in doing so, I've wanted to look at different main kinds of theorizing, each of which has pros and cons. One kind of theorizing is functional theorizing. Functional theorizing suggests that things exist, social things exist, because they provide survival possibilities. They promote the survival of a group. Now, there's difficulties in functional theories because what will produce survival in the short term, like using coal for heat, may produce problems in the long term, side effects. There's also difficulties in predictability. When you start a war, you never know how it's going to end. The war may seem functional, but all kinds of things can happen. So there's some advantages and some limitation to functional theories. Second are neo-institutional theories. These are theories which focus on meaning systems and systems of legitimacy. So countries do many things not because they're best, but because all other countries do them. Common example was a legitimate country had to have an airline for a period of time. Then there are critical event theories, and these are theories that focus on main things like the election of a government official or a physical crisis of an island, an earthquake or a volcano that affects an island. They can also be cusps. So, for example, the World War II is often thought about as a cusp. That means the tensions rose and rose and rose and rose, and eventually the World War II resulted. And then complexity theory applications, autopoiesis and the formation of groups spontaneously for no other reason than that the members interact a lot. So the idea in work following the functional model is to identify possible cultural regions and then evaluate them empirically based on survey data. Compared to the previous group of studies, they tend to identify what are thought of as the cultural regions and then validate them. In the FICE perspective, we've tended to identify what might turn out to be cultural regions and then check and find out. A little bit different. And then something else that we did recently, some of my colleagues and I, is we reviewed all of the studies in management publications, and a couple of them are in marketing, in business, about within country cultural regions. We found 43 between 1991 and 2021. That's 43 over 30 years. That's 1.5 per year, compared to thousands and thousands of studies of country differences. So very few such studies, even though it's been advocated that we attend to within country regions. We look to identify some really good studies, some exemplar studies, and to identify the kinds of theorizing that's most used, which is mainly theory based on functional advantages, relatively little, but some based on institution spread, especially to describe North and South Vietnam and some ideological areas within China, and underused projects that underused kinds of theory, a lack of thinking about complexity and cusps and critical events. So those are some preliminary work that I've been involved in over the years and that I've read over the years that inform the project that I've been working on recently. So the project I've been working on recently has to do with the Canada-U.S. Anglo border. I'm emphasizing a couple of things. It's the border. It does not include places in northern Canada. It does not include the southern or southwest United States. I thought it was theoretically more informative at the moment to focus on to understand why the Canada-U.S. border exists, to focus on areas along that border. As I got into the literature about this region, I tried to sort out not just selectively enough research to frame hypotheses, but pretty much all the research I could find out there. And this contrasts with the studies that I've mentioned in just before, the three main kinds of theorizing about regions that have tended to focus on survey documentation explained by socioeconomic characteristics. That is, wealthy regions will differ from poor regions. In addition to that kind of literature, I found three other things that can be sorted into three other theories that I'll develop in a moment. One is frontier theories, that frontiers are unique. One is first effective settlement theory, suggesting that the first group to settle an area is especially important. And the third is immigration wave, suggesting that subsequent immigration always has huge influence. In so doing, I'm especially contrasting four north-south pairs that have both some socioeconomic characteristics that are similar and also some historic similarities, and I'll develop some of these. The north-south pairs are the Maritime Canada, that's Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and New England is Maine down through Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Ontario, in contrast with the Midland East, and the Midland East, as I've constructed it, goes from New York and Pennsylvania on west through Ohio and up into Michigan. So that's the Midland East, which has interesting links to Ontario. Then the Canadian Prairies and the U.S. Inland West. The Canadian Prairies are the commonly called prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And the U.S. Inland West starts on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, basically, and goes through Montana, North Dakota, and then on south through Kansas and Nevada. I'm leaving out deliberately Arizona and New Mexico as being part of the Southwest. And I also leave out Southern California, Los Angeles and South, as being also part of the Southwest. And then British Columbia and the U.S. Pacific West. And there I mean from Northern California, Washington, Oregon, and into Canada and British Columbia. So 4 north-south pairs I've been especially interested in comparing. Now, some more details. The frontier hypothesis and settlement period theory links back to the first theorizing about regions of the United States. And those are provided by a fellow named Frederick Turner, a book published in 1920, but presentations done in the 1890s that was adopted and made political by at least 2 presidents, especially Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Hoover, with whom Turner actually interacted, and especially Wilson. And this line of thinking has had a substantial influence on the early 20th century United States policies about expansion and such. And basic to this is that all frontiers pose similar functional requirements. To live on a frontier, you have to be able to take care of yourself. You have to be self-reliant. You have to have your own resources. You have to be ready to fight against nature. You have to be ready to occasionally fight against other settlers in your own group or previous groups. So there's some things that are required by all frontiers. Now, this almost died out as a self-contained line of theory, but was revived by a Japanese psychologist who's been so long in the United States as a professor that he's been infected by United States thinking. His name is Shinobu Kitayama, and he developed this idea of survival demands as explaining the frontier. You need certain characteristics, as I've described, to survive, and selective immigration, that people that were frontier oriented are the ones who would actually come. He revived and extended the theory by applying it to the settlement of Hokkaido. Hokkaido was resettled, the original group, the Ainu, driven out in very much the same way that the Americans, both North and South, drove out the indigenous people, partly through unintentionally through the effects of disease, and other ways more intentionally. And Kitayama argues that the same frontier experience appears in the inhabitants and the continuing culture of Hokkaido as compared to mainland Japan, as is argued in the United States. And the frontier hypothesis has also been applied in a number of other countries. Let's see. Right. The Renfro discussion suggests both these immediate influences on the frontier, and then tries to explain why they continue, as does Kitayama to some extent. And the idea there is that people in frontier in areas today that have recognized frontier history tend to learn about and admire and to some extent emulate the characteristics of the early frontier people. The frontier hypothesis mainly explains individualism. So some of those qualities I described would also often be described as individualistic and anti-authoritarianism. You certainly don't need a government to be with you when you're going west, as long as they're not fighting with you. And going west means, well, largely in the United States and Canada, the movement of frontiers was from the east to the west, secondarily from the coast to the interior. That means that there was some settlement along the Pacific coast before the interior, and then within Canada, south to north to some extent. Less so in the United States. It's meaning United States was almost exclusively east to west, to some extent north to south. So in the study that I was working on, the most recently settled regions of the United States and Canada are actually not in the United States. They're British Columbia and the Canadian Prairies. British Columbia in a focus area, right around Vancouver and Victoria Island, were settled much earlier, but then the remainder of British Columbia settled later, and the Canadian Prairies were settled somewhat later than the United States areas straight to the south, meaning the inland west, the United States plains and Rocky Mountains. So those areas, if frontier hypothesis is right, should show more self-reliance than the areas settled first, and those would be New England especially, and also the Maritimes. There's another kind of a theory that's the first effective settler theory that I mentioned. The idea is that the first effective settler's culture dominates an area's future, and that means a couple things. One is path dependence. That doesn't mean that the Puritans who settled Massachusetts does not mean that these theorists expect everybody in Massachusetts to be Puritans today. In fact, it can be that only some aspects of the original society's culture are subsequently traceable. A common argument about the Puritans is that their emphasis on education is what has survived most greatly, both in New England and in the areas that they settled. So there's a path dependence continuity, which makes prediction a little bit difficult, but there it is. For a group to be first effective settlers, they need to completely displace the prior inhabitants. So it recognizes that there were indigenous groups in the United States and Canada, and they were killed, displaced. Also, French areas of the United States don't matter because the French were completely driven out after 1763. There's a decent argument for that because that was mainly the area of the Ohio River Valley on south until you ran into some Spanish areas. But yeah, the French largely wound up in Quebec, and some that were driven out of the Maritimes came back to the Maritimes. And the Métis I mentioned briefly before, those are people that have both French and indigenous people ancestors that formed a distinct separate group, and to which were added some with British and indigenous people ancestry. And they were displaced from their original home in the area around Winnipeg, north and west into the plains, by and large. So what's the argument for first effective settlement mattering? One is selective migration, that the original settlers of a group migrate to areas that are very much like their home areas. So people in Pennsylvania, the argument would be, come from parts of England that are compatible with their home, not just because they like the weather, but because they can survive there. They know how to build houses that will fit that climate. They know how to grow things. That the first effective settlers have a kind of a functional advantage because they have been able to transfer many aspects of their previous experience without having to start to learn everything all over again. Another is social influence. That is, once newcomers come to an area, they're taught about the founder's experience and encouraged by the existing people to admire the founders. Another one is ecological influence, that even to the extent that the new area is different than the home area, the demands of the new area will have the same influence on everyone. So in New England, if you want to do farming, you have to move a lot of stones because of the residual of huge numbers of stones in the ground in the Ice Age. So you have to lift stones out of the ground, build fences, and the environment requires you to do that, whether that's what you were used to doing at home or not. And the ideology that good fences build good neighbors is part of that you would consequently pick up. It also, first effective settlement theory also acknowledges institutional thinking, that is, ways of doing things, ways of thinking that are appropriate or that were typical at home can be transferred as long as they're not suicidal. So if your home society was fishing oriented and you moved to a desert, it'd be suicidal to continue fishing. So that's, it's like that. So there's some recognition in first effective settler theory of institutions. Now, the first effective settlement is complicated, but less complicated than some other things I'll get to. So in the areas that I've been concerned with, the French were first effective settlers in well, they were the first settlers in Maritimes and Quebec and interior riverways. They were largely displaced from these areas and ended up in Quebec, some returning to the Maritimes, as in a moment. Now, the English, Scots, mixed Northern and Southern Irish, and some U.S. Puritans from the Massachusetts area settled the Maritimes. And then they are important because these are multiple kinds of British. It's not all English. It's multiple kinds of British heritage people who at home would have fought one another, but were relatively on the supporting of British side. And that kind of matters. New England was perhaps the most homogeneous of the areas settled, and that was settled by Puritans, which means that they were Anglicans who thought that the Anglican Church was corrupt, so they were going to purify it. And they set up a different sort of a religious base and would not basically allow other people into Massachusetts. That means if a Quaker came there during a period of time, the Quaker could be hung. They would not allow, this is pretty extreme. Also, they were renewed only by having children, not by subsequent immigration after about the time of the British Cromwell parliamentary revolution, because they would be on the Cromwell side, and for the period after Cromwell, they would stay in England. Then a group including Dutch, Swedes, English Quakers, generally pacifists, Southwest German Anabaptists, also pacifist. Southwest German is important. It's from the area around France that was contested between Germany and France during the 18th, throughout the 18th and into the 19th century, and some German Lutherans. Those are the people that settled the mid-Atlantic from Pennsylvania and New York, as I mentioned, out going west from there, especially. Then English royalists settled Virginia and spread from Virginia to Maryland and the Carolinas. And here I want to point out something. In Britain, the English royalists, the people in Virginia, were at about the same time as the settlement of the United States. They were at war with Puritans. Okay, they were killing each other. The idea that the United States was culturally homogenous at its founding because it was all from England, no, that's just simply wrong. That there was hatred, and the fact that the people in the middle were pacifist or relatively tolerant, that really mattered. That kept these two groups from killing each other, okay, and probably allowed the United States to engage in a revolutionary war against England, where otherwise it might not have happened. In the interior, and settled a little bit later than all these others, interior meaning there's mountains a couple hundred miles from the coast in, well, closer than that. I'm actually in one of these mountain areas right now. I'm speaking from the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania. That was settled especially by Northern Irish, That means Protestant Irish, Scots, and later Germans, not just the Southwest Germans, but they settled in this area. So that's another distinctive group. Then the subsequent settlement of the first effective settlers of other parts of the United States and Canada were various groups of Europeans and Easterners. Okay, so there were quite different first effective settlement groups in different parts of the United States. So there's a considerable line of argument, especially by a historian, qua anthropologist by the name of Fisher, that discusses the long-term implications of these original settlement groups. So an example of a proposition, I'm not going to go, I've got propositions for each of the north-south groups that I described based on who the first settlers were. New England Puritans' rebellion from British Anglo-Royalists, yeah, will promote the individualism and an anti-authority orientation in New England. In contrast, just to the north of New England, the Maritimes combination of clan-oriented Scots and post-Culloden, the settlement of the Maritimes began just after a major war between England and Scotland, at which the English won, and they disallowed Highland practices of any kind, the wearing of the kilt, the use of bagpipes, being organized around clans. So Scots that were alienated from England came to the Maritimes. They did not come to New England. They came to the Maritimes. And some of these other groups suggest a greater amount of collectivism and an authoritarian sympathy as compared to New England. So that's if you're going to trace fairly directly first effective settlement arguments. Here's an example of a hypothesis. Immigration wave research. Now, immigration wave research is ordinarily presented in contrast to those preceding two immigration-oriented theories. And in fact, all three of these oriented theories have adherents and opponents. They tend not to be integrated. They tend to be juxtaposed to one another. You believe one or the other. If you're a historian, and these are largely historian-based theoretical perspectives, the idea here is that later waves matter, but it's a mess. Sorting them out is very difficult. To the extent that they can be sorted out, one way of doing so is that the United States and Canada were developed substantially in the late 18th century and into the 19th century when industrialization occurred. And as industrialization developed, de-skilling happened in production processes. So things that used to be handcraft, and you'd have to be an apprentice someplace and then learn how to be a blacksmith, that got replaced by equipment and assembly lines. So that process resulted in de-skilling. You didn't have to know very much to be able to contribute to the manufacturing process. The earliest, so that resulted in some occupation niches for immigrants with skills that didn't fit the new society, who can speak the language well, and who didn't have the farming needed to set up a finance needed to set up a farming operation. So the industrial de-skilling provided places for immigrants. That resulted in a succession of occupants, groups that could occupy industrial manufacturing niches. And this succession differed from city to city. Mainly this is city-oriented industrialization, but I can give you one example. So Boston textiles, the area around Boston had enough water power to be able to set up textile operations. Early on, the textile manufacturing was staffed by local farm women who would come in for a season or for part-time jobs, and this was especially important labor source early after the United States Revolution from Britain. Two groups, French Canadians, people that would come down from Quebec temporarily or sometimes would move down, and then Irish who moved to Boston became the predominant labor source who displaced the local farm women from around 1830 until the U.S. Civil War. Their immigration stopped. The Irish immigration stopped quite abruptly, uh, petered out or slowed down, and was largely taken on. Their roles were largely taken on by Italians after the U.S. Civil War, and they came over in large numbers. Sometime later, there was a lag between the end of the Civil War and a very large movement of African Americans from the South. African Americans could go from plantation economy, unskilled plantation economy jobs to manufacturing jobs, and they tended to take on in the Boston area jobs that had previously been Irish and then Italian. So there was a succession of immigrant groups in Boston, and the same kind of succession happened in many other places. So the original first effective settlers, the question is, did their culture prevail and spread, or was it replaced or substantially altered by these newcomers, or what happened? Well, that becomes difficult in immigration wave research. So there are intergroup dynamics between the first settlers and later immigrant waves. Some of it is just simple discrimination and exploitation. Some of it is more complicated transfer of ideas. Sometimes subgroups would develop by local origin or time within an ethnic community. So Irish might not be Irish, but there could be ethnic or sub-communities within Irish, depending on when they came. So there was a pre-potato famine group of Irish and a post-potato famine group of Irish, and those could have been different. As I understand, they were less so than Northern and Southern Irish. The Protestant Catholic mingling in Northern Irish, that group differed from the more strictly Celtic group. There were more differences among Italian groups based on city of origin. That mattered quite a lot. Also, intergroup dynamics, not just between the first settlers and immigrants, but between ethnic communities, some of which were happier together than others. Another outcome that immigration research needs to consider is Mosaic effects. That means that sometimes stable communities, socially segregated urban communities would develop. So you'd have a Chinatown and a Little Italy and such like, a Little Israel. When I was growing up, we had a very strong Jewish community that referred to itself as Little Israel. And there was an Italian community that was close to a Catholic church that was, it's called White City, because not of the race of the people, but they had white houses. A lot of them had white color painting on the houses. But in any case, there's an issue whether those segregated communities were stable or would, change. Similarly, in the prairies and plains, there was enough distance that and support from the Canadian government for a group to buy a large area for its co-community people to settle in. Segregated farming communities developed in parts of the prairies and plains. Another possibility in immigration wave theory is that cultural blending, melting pots effects would occur. Another issue in immigration wave theory is that it's linked to immigration policy, which changed in somewhat parallel ways, but somewhat different ways in Canada and the United States. For example, in late 19th century, both countries had clearly exploitive policies about Asians. That is, Asians were needed to build the railroads, especially Chinese. So Chinese were actively recruited. So what happened was a large number and proportion of men came from China to build the railways. Then they weren't needed anymore and they weren't liked very much. So huge restrictions were put on about immigration of other Asians. Usually what happened is that the original Asians were Chinese men, something on the order of 90%. They were not allowed to bring their wives. They didn't have enough money to go back home, so they formed substantial communities that simply died out, with a little bit of a remnant here and there. So the Chinese community in Vancouver can be linked back to this time. It included the very few, descendants of the very few proportion of men who had wives, who could bring wives over with them. So pretty nasty, both in the United States and in Canada. I could go on with other examples, but both areas became much more open in immigration policy after World War II, especially after about 1960s, 1970s. Oh, I've got some things here about African heritage biases that may be relevant because there may be very different African heritage issues that show up in Brazil. I thought I'd mention them. So before the Civil War, Canada was a wonderful place if you're African American, let's use for now. The Northeast United States was not great, but better than the South. If you're a black in the Northeastern United States, you're subject to being captured and sent back if you had been an escaped slave. And since there'd be a view that African is an African is an African, even if you're a legally free African, you could be kidnapped and taken to the South. Legislation called the Fugitive Slave Acts that got harshened in 1850 made the Northeast United States problematic. So a number of African heritage people went to Canada at that time, and the southern U.S. Was even more problematic, obviously. After Civil War, it changed. Canada established a number of immigration restraints on African immigrants from the United States. It became much harder to get into Canada. The argument that you'll see in their immigration literature, Canada's immigration literature, is Africans will not be able to adapt because of their warm-oriented physiology. So that's kind of nasty. So Canada, I usually think of as open, more friendly, and helpful to immigrants than is the United States, but that's not been always the case. Now I've made a mistake, and I've got to figure out how to get back. Probably like this, and probably like, okay. All right. Let's see, from current slide. Now I want to get through a couple of other things, so I'm going to try to get past the immigration-based theories and into some others. But you can probably tell from what I've said about immigration wave research, it's very, very complicated, okay? Probably best studied using ethnographies and localized survey studies. The kind of survey research that I do is probably just not good at getting at immigration wave processes. So what I've done only is to identify the proportion of people who are currently at the time of data collection in each area that I'm studying who are immigrants, who were born in another country, and suggest that there might be cultural effects of being born abroad. Now that might be silly, but the distribution of born abroad has changed quite a bit due to post-World War II openness. Due to post-World War II openness, a larger proportion of immigrants come from collectivist societies than during the 19th century and early 20th century. So many more in the United States, from Mexico, both countries from Asia, both countries from Eastern Europe, all of which suggest relative collectivism to the existing society. So I can check that kind of hypothesis, but it's very limited. What the main research about regions in the management and business literature is based on socioeconomic conditions. These are strongly functional. based on survival demands. Many are based on a vulnerability principle. That is, that if there is a threat to survival, people need to rely on authorities, friends, and neighbors. In other words, they need to rely less on themselves and more on other people, collectivist sorts of things, and authorities in order to survive. Whereas people that are not vulnerable or areas where people in general are not very vulnerable can be more self-reliant and resistant to authority. Another kind of socioeconomic condition has to do with traditional agriculture and the predominant agricultural type, distinguishing between areas that are primarily urban, parts of the two countries that are based on agriculture, and parts that are based on ranches. And ranches mean mainly raising cattle and sheep that require large amounts of land, more so than do farms. So generally, the hypotheses here are fairly straightforward. GDP per capita, median household income would suggest wealth. Wealthy geographic areas are able to provide protection and infrastructure to the population in general that avoids the effects of floods, tornadoes, droughts, other aspects of vulnerability. So region wealth can have an effect. Poverty, in the sense of proportion of poor people, and that's quite different from the average level of prosperity or GDP, which can be very high in like Alberta, which is largely an oil economy. So food insecurity, just like other aspects of vulnerability, is an indicator of poverty, and meaning poor housing, limited medical care, and anything associated with having a large proportion of poor people would suggest relying on one another, collectivism, and relying on authorities to provide them with what's needed. So poverty would suggest collectivism and deference to authority. Life expectancy is another way to get at overall vulnerability, but it extends beyond poverty effects to include the existence of spread of communicable diseases due to crowding, poor sanitation, and pollution and environmental hazards that are no respecter of wealth, personal wealth. Yeah, there's an old joke about Los Angeles that I don't trust air unless I can see it. Pollution, yep. And also diseases of prosperity. So life expectancy also is an aspect of vulnerability, but is associated with many other socioeconomic conditions. The argument still here is that support for collectivism and deference to authority should be associated with low life expectancy, whereas the reverse for long life expectancy. Another aspect of vulnerability is natural disasters. And natural disasters are not just the physical things themselves, like floods, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, but whether you're prepared for them, whether an area is prepared for them. So frost is a disaster in Florida. Frost is not a disaster in Toronto. Heat can be a disaster. People die. In Toronto, heat is not a disaster. In Florida, you go to a shopping mall or inside your house and you get cool. So natural disasters depend both on what's occurring in the environment, how different it is from what usually occurs, and how prepared an area is. And I can specify, I've specified some areas that have high vulnerability to natural disasters, notably the Pacific Northwest, least exposure and best preparation, Maritimes, and New England. So the former should be, the argument would be, should be more collective and power supportive, and the latter more self-reliant. Urbanization, farming, and ranching is tough. There's an argument that urbanization promotes individualism because it allows people to have lots of choices, And there's an argument that population density from urbanization promotes collectivism. Ranching is clearer. Ranching, the argument is ranching promotes individualism. There's so much distance involved. And even though there's media communication, there's some things you can't do. You can't do CPR by radio. You got to be there. There's just some things that about ranching that require self-reliance. On balance, self-reliance and low deference to authority should go along with ranching. Urban, tough, but maybe more collective-oriented. Farming in the middle. Farming is tough because nowadays farming areas have been very much technologized, modernized, and that allows a mix of community reliance and self-reliance. So let's see, immigration-oriented culture research, those theories are put up against one another, and you kind of have to treat frontier hypothesis against the first effective settlement, against the wave hypothesis. The socioeconomic ones you could combine. Implications for your part of the world, and I've had to think about this because of course, we want to be able to make application to lots of places. What's likely to be unique and what's likely to be general? A lot probably applies to Brazil because many aspects of the settlement, resettlement from first people are have some similarities. There may be greater historical threat from non-Lusophone neighbors, especially way down south, than there is between the United States and Canada. Maybe. You also have some First Nation people, indigenous people who are first effective settlers of a large area. The United States has their small areas, Canada's somewhat largest areas. In the ranching, farming, urban, I have a sense that coffee agriculture is kind of qualitatively different from most farming. And I was wondering if the nature of coffee agriculture might have a distinctive effect in some parts of Brazil. I'm not sure. From my brief checking, Brazil's immigration is mainly from other parts of Latin America and from the United States. It has had significantly less as compared to Canada and the US from Asia and from Southern Europe, but I'm not sure. I also wonder whether the post-slavery heritage is different. So in the United States, after the Civil War, lots of African Americans 30 years later started to move north, but not into Canada. I don't know what happened from the predominantly slave areas of Brazil. In Portugal, I've thought that the immigration theories just don't work, that you'd have to go back to earlier dynamics than immigration, intercultural dynamics with other nations, but socioeconomics may apply. Also, Portugal doesn't have a lot of Lusophone neighbors, so the United States and Canada are both English-speaking, so there may be a greater sense of threat. I wondered about that for Portugal. For Lusophone Africa, again, real different. Portuguese dominated parts of Africa, but didn't resettle there. So you have something like first effective settler groups that are indigenous groups that may have been affected by the Bantu diaspora, but that was a long time ago. They also the military threat to the extent that threat creates a sense of vulnerability, creates a sense of need for collective action and deference to authority, that may have a general pressing towards collectivism and power deference. Also, socioeconomics of the United States and Canada are on a relatively high level of prosperity and protection from vulnerability. My sense is that there's less protection from vulnerability in Angola and Mozambique and such. So I don't know if the effects are continuous. And as to Macau and Goa, I can't even guess. There just seem to be. I don't know why Macau still, has any independence at all. Just have the guess. Anyway, so I've developed an example, and it's taken me many years from the relatively simple situation by global standards of northern United States and the Canada border. To study regions, to do a decent job of studying regions as we have countries, we just need to do some more theorizing of the kinds that I think that I've tried to introduce. I think I'm done.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was amazing. It is very nice to reflect about cultures, about subcultures. Some regions really differ meaningfully from characteristics of the country as a whole. Your presentation naturally led me to reflect about the southern region in Brazil, for instance, that differs in some aspects from the Brazilian culture, probably because of the presence of Europeans during the colonization time, the so-called European heritage, and maybe the weather, the climate, even though not all regions that countries use for internal administration are culturally significant. You even mentioned in your presentation the state of Rio Grande do Sul, which is part of this region in Brazil. So it was very interesting. So for us to start the discussion, Professor, I have a question, a general question first. Uh, Generally speaking, especially for those here who are not familiar with cultural studies or with cross-cultural studies, why would studying country cultural regions or studying regions that go beyond countries be preferable to studying countries? Would it be the excessive country cultural generalizations?
Uh, First off, I think that there's a great deal of evidence that countries are culturally significant. So that don't want to overemphasize the significance of regions. I've developed theories and explanations about why they may be different, but yeah, again, I don't want to emphasize. I'm looking for those few geographic regions that really might differ from the rest. So far in the North America study, I'm only beginning to look at the results. It looks like the Maritimes of Canada may be more distinct from the rest of the United States and Canada to want to study separately and provide separate scores for. So I've given you lots of reasons to expect that there may be differences, but I haven't given you data indicating whether there really are differences in management related variables.
I
Okay.
see.
So I'm explaining how kind of one way to look. Now, one study fairly recently published in 2021 by Misho Minkov and Annalie Casa uh, deals well with states of the United States and shows some pretty substantial differences between U.S. states. But I still want to look carefully to see where those differences are. Within the United States, one of the areas that I kind of bracketed out for now, the southeastern United States, has been documented to be pretty distinct from other parts in terms of things like politeness and
Mhm.
uh, the way one needs to relate to other people need to relate to people indirectly rather than be directly critical, and that might have implications for performance feedback and yeah, handling promotions and rewarding some people without embarrassing others, and So there may be some clear region things, but take care. Just take care not to
Yeah,
overemphasize regions. Countries really do seem to matter.
yeah. Thank you. Uh, you presented some propositions, Professor, in your presentation that caught my attention. They made me reflect somehow. First, you said, in other words, that the wealthier a region, the richer a region, theorizing, of course, the more individualistic or self-reliant its
Right.
inhabitants will be, and the less deference they will show
Yeah.
to authorities. And second, you mentioned that poverty in a region will lead its inhabitants to be more collectivist and to show more deference to authorities.
Right.
Third, if I'm not mistaken, regions with short life expectancy will lead its inhabitants to be more collectivist and to show more deference to authority. And finally, regions vulnerable to natural disasters will lead
Yeah.
its inhabitants to be more collectivist and to show more deference to
Yeah.
authorities. At this point of the presentation, I thought to myself, well, based on these four propositions, I could say in general that the more vulnerable a region, regardless of the type of vulnerability, social, economic, natural disasters,
Right.
etc., the more collectivist people will be and
Right.
the more they will show deference to authorities.
Right.
But then, when you presented another proposition, uh, it didn't follow maybe the reasoning that I was having completely. The
Right.
proposition is the one regarding urbanization. It
Right.
says collectivism and reliance on superiors will be higher in urban regions than in ranching or farming regions. Or, in other words, people in ranching or farming regions will be more individualistic and will not rely on superiors compared to people in urban regions.
Yeah.
Here in Brazil, Professor Peterson, uh, at least urbanization normally goes along with wealth, richness, and farming areas normally go along with poverty. So here in Brazil, maybe we would expect exactly the opposite, based on
Yeah.
vulnerabilities. We would expect urban regions to be more individualistic and ranching and farming regions to be more collectivist. You mentioned that physical dispersion would be the reason behind that. So my question is, what would physical dispersion mean in this scenario again? Just for me to completely understand that, please.
Sure. I don't know how. Do you measure units in acres? Does the idea of an acre make sense to you?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So a ranch in a small ranch in Montana might be 500 acres. A farm might be 50 acres. So you need more land so that the people living on the land are more separate from one another. It just kind of
Yeah,
goes together. So that's what it means.
I
The
see.
ranchers kind of, because each one has a large parcel of land, their houses are on that parcel of land and they're hence separate from one another.
Okay, now
So
it makes sense.
you
Yes.
you have to drive a ways to get to your neighbor.
I
Yeah.
see. I see.
Yeah,
So
and
less human contact, let's say, right?
less access to help.
I see.
It's not so much a socialization. Well, maybe it is a socialization thing, but it's a yeah, less access to help.
I
And
see.
that was also true of farmers in during the early settlement periods. I mean, especially I'm thinking about Midwest farmers, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri. They would their transportation was more limited, so a smaller amount of physical difference meant still difficulty in getting to someone else. It's accessibility of help
I see.
from other people. So you're kind of forced to be on your own because if you break your leg, you can't go to a doctor because there's no doctor. You can't get there. If your tractor breaks, it takes you a day to get to the tractor fixing place. So it's a sort of a practical, a sort of a practical matter. So in the yeah,
I
so,
see.
so you have to be suited to being alone, and that's the line of argument. And that line of argument may be wrong, but also I did notice as I started working in this theory that many of that there is a vulnerability principle that applied to a lot of socioeconomical conditions, and the authors didn't necessarily say that as something though that I have noticed and have emphasized in recounting it. Also, in country level research, the relationship between high GDP and wealth and individualism is really clear. It replicates in any kind of a country culture study. So that's really clear at the societal level. Not at the individual level. It doesn't mean that wealthy people are more individualistic than in their attitudes than poor people as individuals, but as societal characteristics, it's real clear.
I see. Okay,
And
thank
I
you.
think that wealth has a vulnerability, aspect to it.
Yeah,
Another aspect is if you're vulnerable, you're going to rely on your family more because you can trust your family. So that's a
it makes
particular
sense.
extended family form of collectivism.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it makes sense. That's
yeah.
right. Just one more question, Professor. In your presentation, I think when you talked about the so-called first effective settler group theory, you mentioned that first settlers migrate to places like their home. This is very easy to see in practice in Brazil. For instance, Europeans migrated to the south of Brazil probably because of the climate, because of the weather. Uh, but my question is, why do only first settlers do that? Shouldn't we also expect that later settlers would do the same, would migrate to places like their home? Why is that a characteristic of first settlers?
The uh, the most elaborate first effective settlement models suggest that later settlers tend to migrate towards places where they will be welcome, where they are culturally similar to the people that moved there previously. So that's an special attraction for later settlers. So they're not going to get beaten up. I mean, harmed. They're going to be treated kindly. That they can take advantage of whatever's been established by their predecessors. So that's part of the reasoning. That may go along with. I think that the later settlers also may find may have this niche, an aspect of this niche thing. They may look for places where it's easy to live and climate and land characteristics may be less critical for later settlers than for first settlers, because later settlers are trying to adapt not just to the physical setting, but to what's already there, to the opportunities that are available that are already there. So let's say that later settlers in the Midwest might be shopkeepers. There's a niche available for them, not in farming that they have an advantage of reproducing the farming techniques that are relatively weather specific, but they may be able to fill a niche um, in setting up shops and stores to supply farmers, and
Hmm,
that may be less weather related. I think that's the line that there's a guy named Woodard that wrote a book that's very clear advocacy of first effective settlement and takes a view that later waves simply don't matter. Very, very bald about that, and I think that would be part of what he would argue.
yeah.
That the niche that later settlers are trying to fit into is not as determined by uh, physical aspects of land or climate.
I see.
And again, it's not that people go where they like the climate, it's people go where they can do the same things they already know how to do rather than have to both learn new things and eat at the same time. You have to, when you go somewhere, you have to survive in the short term. You got to
Yeah,
eat.
you're
You
right.
got to build a house that's going to stay up, and you got to eat. And it's easiest if you do that in a place where you already know how to do those two things, rather than a place where you can't.
It makes sense. Otherwise, if you make that decision only based on weather, you
Yeah.
may end up dying
Yeah,
comfortably.
exactly. You're happily dying. I mean,
Happily
or
dying.
what? Honestly, what would happen most? The most frequent stories I've read are that those people go back. So there, one community. I read a lot about Kansas. One community from England. It was made up of aristocrats, and they wanted to set up an aristocrat life, and they brought all of their toys. Yeah, and it was just too difficult. So they went back home. Yep.
Uh, guys, would anyone like to make any comment or question? Please feel free to participate. Just click on raise your hand button. Would anyone like to participate to make any question? Uh, I have just one curiosity, Professor Peterson. With respect to language, does language play a big role in theorizing immigrant societies in the Americas? I thought about, for example, immigrants in Florida State in the USA. I've heard that they keep on using their native languages like Spanish, Latinos in Florida, even though they are inserted in an English native country. Does it play a big role?
In I can answer that in two ways. One, I have done some research about Florida. I used to live in Miami, so and I was very interested in the Cuban and the Haitian communities. But also in the United States almost it came close to having German as a second language.
Wow, I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
the number of immigrants were so strong that there were laws requiring education in German in some states. I believe in Ohio, for example. And also, it was a long time before German heritage churches, Lutheran churches especially, had their services in English. That I thought that the transition might have occurred when Germany became a stressful place in World War II or World War One and World War II, but no, it was before the Civil War that kind of it spontaneously dissipated, and I don't know why. Okay, so that's one of the puzzles I would actually like to run down.
Hmm.
Let's see. Some of that would now in the situation in Miami when I was studying Cuban immigrant groups, the yeah, you could see the melting pot-ishness increase, but it would increase generation by generation rather than within one person. The people that first arrived, if they arrived in their 40s and 50s, might not learn English and just find a way to live in the Spanish-speaking community in Miami, and that could be done. So that would be, and that would also be part of a mosaic effect, uh,
Hmm.
situation. You would have communities that would,
Hmm.
would have a preferred language that's not English. Yeah, so there's language things, but it's relatively communities that were able to be large enough and to be self-contained.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. Luis Fernando raised his hand. Please feel free, Luis. You can unmute your microphone and open up your camera if you want.
Hi, Professor Mark and Professor André. My question is related to the future of a nation. Maybe I will need some help from Professor André, but let's try. You told that, Professor Mark, that Puritans, they influenced the region that they lived in some parts of USA. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the past of a nation can influence the future of a nation? A question related to the thinking, religious thinking. How in USA the Puritan thinking, the way of thought, influenced USA today. For example, in Brazil, people usually say that Brazil is Brazil because of its Catholic roots, and USA is USA because of its Protestant, Puritan, essentially, perspectives from the past. How we can see today in the politics, economics, administration field, how these questions are related to the past and how these little decisions or big decisions can change the future of a region or a nation, please.
Yeah, I can talk about that. That has to do with both culture change, culture continuance, and path dependence sorts of issues. It also has to do with some region issues. So in the United States, it would be reasonable to argue that the early settlement in the United States was distinctly not Catholic. So to say it was Puritan is a bit more problematic because it included the Puritans in New England and the same people that were trying to kill the Puritans in Virginia. And the leaders of the Revolution were people who would have been trying to kill Puritans in the Cromwell Revolution period. So the United States is the traditions are Protestant as opposed to Catholic, but they're not Puritan. A second thing is the path dependence sort of issue. Sometimes you have to think a bit in the abstract to trace the subsequent effect of a religious or ideological group. So there's a couple of influences. One you can see by contrasting, well, Western Europe, United States, and South America with Russia. Russia never experienced the Protestant Revolution. Russia is an Orthodox heritage country. They just never went through that conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism. And the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism included some abstract kinds of things like, do you defer to authority or not? Yep. So do you have a pope? Do you have bishops? Now, within the United States, in the Anglican Church, the Virginia dominant church, you had something very much like bishops, although not a pope. So you had a fair amount of authority deference. Similarly, there is an argument. This is the Weber argument that individualism, self-dependence, is particularly characteristic of Protestantism. That means that each person is responsible for their own relationship with God. Full stop. You and God. Doesn't matter what your wife, your husband, your parents, it's you and God. Everybody's individually related to God. Now, if you throw out the part of related to God and you keep that, what's left? Well, you got everybody's responsible for themselves. You understand that idea? So there's a kind of a generalization of some aspect of Protestantism that you're not responsible to God, but you're responsible to the law. Okay, so but individually responsible for the law. It's not your parents aren't punished, your siblings aren't punished. It's you who are punished if you break the law. Similarly, you're responsible for your own physical well-being, if not spiritual. If spiritual stuff doesn't matter, you're responsible for your own physical well-being, material well-being. You to buy your own house, to be able to get your own food. So the idea is that sometimes a tradition that Weber argued was characteristic of Protestantism in general continued even when the theological stuff became less common or less central to the society. Yeah, and the argument then would be that Catholicism suggests a reliance on powerful parties and a communal responsibility to others in your family and to in your church to a larger extent. So that would be the kind of the long-term implications and diffusion of what was originally a religious difference. Those are some of the arguments, and I'm not taking a stand on any of those arguments. Actually, I'm just explaining what they would be, with maybe with the exception that I don't think Russia understands this tension this Protestant Catholic thing. They just don't, and that's from being in Russia a little bit and talking to influential people there. There's some things that they just don't get that are taken for granted in North America. Can I say more? Did I get close to your question?
It's okay, but I think in one question, for example, in Germany, how the immigration question can influence the country in the next years, in your
Yeah,
opinion, for example?
yeah. I think that I could I could go two ways. I could try to go from intuition to answer that question, and from my German friends and my Turkish friends and Turkish heritage friends in Germany, of which I have a number. Or I could try to work off of the theories that are available so far. So some of the theories that are available so far would suggest that as immigrants, and let me pick on Turks as a traditional large immigrant group, and let's make it Syrians as a new immigrant group. As those groups become more wealthy, they will become more like a variety of Germans. So that would be one thing that might happen over time. Um, let's see, first effective settlement, that it'd be very difficult for new groups. First effective settlement would argue that they're going to get integrated and socialized in other ways. That that the new groups over time will simply become more like Germans because they learn about Germany and are socialized into German history and thinking. Uh, Immigration wave theory might suggest, well, especially if a group is large enough and decides to form a community, a physical community of substance. So let's say that all the Turks were all to move to Bavaria. Okay, so the Turks took over a large chunk of German ground. Then you might wind up with something like a mosaic or patchwork situation, but there would be wind up, I think, tension on around the borders, and there is tension with the various immigrant communities, Turkish and Syrian in Germany. You would wind up with tension that would promote collectivism by both groups and deference to authority. So collectivism, deference to authority in traditional Germany means Nazism. Yeah, a strong, collective, authority-oriented group. So if Germans feel threatened, that would promote fascism. Within the Turkish group, it would promote also some kind of Maybe it would promote collectivism. Collectivism doesn't have to be aggressive. So you have nice, gentle forms of collectivism where outside groups are nice. They're just not us. And then you have forms of collectivism, and I think especially as U.S. street gangs as collectivist. Okay, you protect one another in your gang, and you kill the gang on the next block. Yeah, so that's the nasty form. That's what collectivism combined with, well, this is something that I think that Russian society mixes up with individualism. Um, individualism in the United States has a nice side that everybody sails their own boat unless they see their neighbor's boat sinking, in which case they go and try to help bail. But otherwise, it's not your business. The other boat doesn't want you. You don't want the other boat. You're taking care of yourselves. But unless there's just a disaster and you don't want people to die, you don't want awful things to happen, so you take care of each other. So that Russian views of individualism don't get that. Individualism has borders to it. Okay, and similarly, collectivism can be nice or it can be nasty. Okay, Japanese collectivism is relatively nice. Yeah, outsiders are radically different, but yeah, they're okay. We can work with them and do stuff with them, and that's cool. I feel like I got digressed a little bit. Did I? So you're asking me about
Professor, it seems that you have to unmute your microphone.
okay, my back.
Yeah, thank you.
Once you have a large enough group, it can start to think of itself as wanting to be a separate country. So Quebec now and again tries to be a separate country. Yeah, Scotland now and again tries to be a separate country. Yeah, the Donbass region of Ukraine, yeah, wanted to be a separate country. So once you have a large enough ethnic group, all located together, then you can, then sometimes you get the formation of separate countries. That can happen.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for
Um,
the words, Professor Mark and
Sure.
Professor Andre.
Thanks for
Thank you very much, Luis. It was a very nice question. That issue also caught my attention during the presentation. I was amazed by how much culture, religion, and history are intertwined when Professor Peterson mentioned Anglicans, Puritans, Lutherans, and a lot of different influences of different people and with different religious origins. That was nice. Uh, would anyone else like to participate, or would you, Luis, like to make any other comment or question? Okay. Would
I'm okay.
anyone else like to participate, guys? Uh, it is indeed a very challenging research. I was impressed. I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, what would be the data collection instruments to analyze all those kind of things? And you mentioned ethnography, Professor, but indeed, we know that cultures are not formed overnight and they're not changed overnight. So I was thinking in practice how challenging it must be to investigate these objects, these research objects. Uh, Guys, if there are no further questions, the discussion is great. I wish we had more time, but we need to finish our discussion. I would like to thank everyone for participating. Thank you very much again, Professor Mark Peterson, for your presentation, for dedicating your precious time to us. Thank you very much. The next webinar, guys, will be announced soon. Probably it will take place in October, if I'm not mistaken, or November. You will be notified. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much again, Professor Mark Peterson, and say hi to Susan.
Okay, will do.
Okay, bye-bye. Take care, guys. See ya.
Bye-bye.